Blood smells like rusted iron, but a werewolf's blood carries the sharp bite of pine and winter static. For 20 years Brigid scrubbed that scent from the stone floors of the High Keep. She kept her eyes down her teeth, blunt passing as a frail human orphan. She locked her beast away in the dark, certain the cage of her ribs was unbreakable. But she didn't account for the Alpha King, or the bloody night he finally pushed her to let the monster breathe. The lye soap had eaten the top layer of skin off Brigid's hands by her 10th winter. By her 25th, her fingers looked like they belonged to a corpse red raw and perpetually cracked. It was a necessary pain. The harsh chemical burn of the lye masked the faint, lingering scent of petrica and wild mint that seeped from her pores when she sweated. In the stone halls of Highgrove, a stray scent meant death. Highgrove was a fortress built on the bones of conquered packs. It was a brutal, towering monolith of dark granite perched on a cliff that chewed on the northern winds. Humans lived in the lower rings, serving as labourers, smiths, and scullery maids. The Lycans took the upper keep. They were the lords, the knights, the absolute rulers of the realm. A human was property. But an unregistered wolf, a rogue living within the castle walls, was a trophy waiting to be skinned. Brigid wrung out a heavy linen tunic over the wooden wash bucket. The freezing water bit into her joints. She welcomed the ache. Physical discomfort in her human form kept the beast distracted. Deep inside her chest, behind the cage of her ribs, the wolf paced. It didn't sleep. It hadn't slept in 2 decades. It just walked a relentless, maddening circle in the dark of her mind, dragging its claws against her sanity. Let us out. It rumbled a phantom vibration in her throat. Brigid swallowed it down with a mouthful of cold air. No, she had been 5 years old when her father's pack was slaughtered by the previous king. She remembered the fire, the screaming, the smell of singed fur. Her mother had shoved her into a root cellar, smearing the child's face with mashed wolfsbane and pig's blood. "You are human," her mother had whispered, her eyes glowing yellow in the dark. "If you shift, you die. If you bare your teeth, you die. Hide the wolf, Brigid. Swallow her whole." She had obeyed. For 20 years she swallowed the wolf. Every full moon was an exercise in pure agony. While the recognized pack howled from the battlements running free in the designated hunting woods, Brigid curled into a ball on the dirt floor of her cramped quarters. Her bones would soften, attempting to lengthen and snap into a canine frame. She would bite down on a leather strap until her gums bled, forcing her body to remain human through sheer stubborn terror. Over the years, the suppressed shifts had taken a toll. She suffered from chronic migraines. Her hearing was agonizingly sharp. Sometimes in the dead of winter, her body ran a fever so high her skin steamed in the courtyard. "You're scrubbing a hole through that tunic, girl." Brigid blinked, breaking her trance. Greta the head laundress dumped another basket of blood-stained clothes beside her. Greta was human, entirely blind in her left eye, and moved with the slow, deliberate shuffle of a woman who had survived 4 different kings. "Sorry," Brigid murmured. She kept her voice raspy soft, unassuming. "Don't apologize, just work faster." Greta grunted. "The hunting party returns by nightfall. The king's men will be wanting hot baths and clean linens, and they don't take kindly to waiting." Brigid's heart kicked off a heavy, syncopated rhythm. The king, King Garrick. He had taken the throne 5 years ago after his father, the man who slaughtered Brigid's family, died of a wasting sickness. Garrick was a different breed of brutal. Where his father was a tyrant who killed for pleasure, Garrick was a tactician who killed for peace. He had spent his entire reign on the borders crushing rebellions and uniting the fractured northern territories with an iron fist. He rarely stayed in Highgrove for more than a month at a time. "Is he injured?" Brigid asked, keeping her eyes on the washboard. "They say they caught an ambush in the Iron Valley, lost 3 men. The king took a blade to the shoulder, but you know how they heal." Greta said, shaking her head. Just means he'll be in a foul mood. Keep your head down, Brigid. The wolves are restless when they smell their own blood. I know Brigid thought. She could already smell it. The wind shifted, blowing down from the upper gates. Over the stench of wood smoke, horse dung, and freezing mud it hit her. It was a heavy, suffocating scent. Ozone, crushed pine, old blood. It was the scent of an alpha, and it made the hidden wolf inside her thrash against her spine. She gripped the edges of the wooden tub. Her knuckles turned white, her fingernails elongated by a fraction of an inch, the beds throbbing with pressure. She forced them back, squeezing her eyes shut. Hide. A horn blasted from the main courtyard. The ground vibrated under Brigid's soaked leather boots. The king had arrived. The great hall was a cavern of noise and heat. Massive hearths roared at either end, spitting embers onto the soot-stained flagstones. Long wooden tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar root vegetables and kegs of dark ale. Brigid moved through the shadows of the pillars, carrying a heavy pitcher of hot water and a stack of clean linen. She wore a drab grey dress, an apron stained with soot, and a woolen cap pulled low over her mousy brown hair. She was invisible. Just another human servant meant to bleed quietly into the background. She approached the high table. Garrick sat in the centre. He didn't sit like a king holding court. He sat like a predator resting between kills. He was massive built, broad and thick, wearing leather armour scarred by countless blades. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat and sleet. His face was a map of hard angles dominated by eyes the colour of a bruised winter sky. He was bleeding. A deep gash tore through the pauldron of his armour, soaking the leather in dark crimson. A nervous human healer was hovering near him, hands trembling as he tried to clean the wound. "Get out of the way, old man." One of Garrick's generals, a scarred brute named Corvin, barked at the healer. "Your hands are shaking so badly you'll poke his eye out." "Pardon, my lord, I just need water." "I have the water," Brigid said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the immediate circle. Garrick's head snapped toward her. Brigid froze. Her lungs seized. The sheer crushing weight of his alpha aura hit her like a physical blow. To a human it would feel like a sudden drop in air pressure, a wave of instinctual fear. To a wolf it was a command. Submit. Bare your neck. Kneel. The beast inside Brigid roared in furious defiance. Her knees locked, her jaw clamped shut. She had to force herself to tremble, mimicking the human reaction, while every instinct screamed at her to bare her teeth and challenge the oppressive weight. She stepped forward, keeping her chin tucked against her collarbone, and set the heavy pitcher on the table. She began to fold the linens. Garrick didn't look away from her. She could feel his gaze on the top of her head. It burned. "You!" he rumbled. His voice was a low octave that vibrated in Brigid's chest cavity. "Yes, my king," she whispered. "Look at me." Brigid's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't. If she looked at him, he would see it. Wolf eyes didn't lie. But defying a direct order from the Alpha King was a death sentence. Slowly she raised her head. She kept her eyelids heavy, adopting the dull, terrified expression of a broken servant. She met his bruised sky eyes. Garrick frowned. The scar over his left eyebrow pulled tight. He leaned forward, ignoring the protests of the old healer. He inhaled. It was a subtle shift of his shoulders, a slow intake of breath through his nose. He was catching her scent. Brigid stopped breathing entirely. She smelled like lye soap-stale smoke and human sweat. She had made sure of it. She had even rubbed crushed garlic on her wrists before entering the hall. But Garrick was not an ordinary wolf. He reached out. His hand, vast and rough, clamped around her wrist. Brigid flinched. The heat of his skin was shocking. It seared straight through the damp wool of her sleeve. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. The rest of the hall was roaring with drunken laughter. but in their small radius everything was dead silent. "Brigid, sire." She lied. Her birth name was long buried. Garrick's thumb pressed into the inside of her wrist, right over her pulse point. Brigid panicked. A human heart under the gaze of an alpha should be rabbit-fast, fluttering in pure terror. Her heart was beating with the slow, heavy, measured thud of a cornered predator. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. She deliberately bit the inside of her cheek. Hard. The sudden spike of pain made her pulse jump erratic and fast. Garrick's eyes narrowed. He looked at her wrist, then back up to her face. He smelled the fresh drop of copper blood in her mouth. "You don't smell like fear." Garrick stated his voice, a dangerous murmur meant only for her. "I am terrified, my king." Brigid whispered truthfully. Just not of him. She was terrified of herself. Garrick studied her face. He was searching for something. Ambition. Deceit. An assassination plot. What he found seemed to confuse him. He found a void. A wall of solid iron where a human's fragile emotions should be. Before he could push further, Corvin slammed his fist on the table. "My king, the scouts report the rebel stragglers are trapped in the eastern gorge. If we ride before dawn, we can skin them all by sunrise." Garrick broke his gaze from Brigid. The suffocating pressure eased. He released her wrist. "Have the men rest." Garrick ordered, his attention snapping back to his general. "We march at first light." Brigid didn't wait to be dismissed. She backed away, leaving the water and bandages, and practically fled into the shadows of the service corridor. Once she was out of sight, she slumped against the cold stone wall, clutching her chest. She was gasping for air. The spot where Garrick had touched her wrist was throbbing, glowing with a phantom heat. He knows her wolf snarled in the dark. He felt us. "Let me out. Let me rip his throat out before he hangs us. Shut up." Brigid hissed to the empty hallway, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." She had survived 20 years. She would not die today. She just had to stay away from the king. 3 days later, the moon began to wax full. The winter solstice brought a bitter, killing frost to Highgrove. It also brought the fever. The castle preparations for the solstice feast were frantic, and the human servants were pushed to the brink of collapse. Brigid was dying. She could feel it. The wolfsbane paste she had secretly consumed to suppress the impending full moon shift was failing. Her tolerance had grown too high. The poison was destroying her liver, but it wasn't strong enough to keep the wolf asleep anymore. Every joint in her body felt like it was packed with shattered glass. Her vision blurred, washing out into stark monochrome before snapping back to color. Her gums throbbed so violently she could barely close her mouth. "You look like a corpse," Greta muttered, passing Brigid in the lower kitchens. "Go to the crypts. Fetch the old winter potatoes. It's freezing down there, might bring your fever down." It was a kindness. Greta was giving her an excuse to hide in the dark. Brigid nodded stiffly. She grabbed a burlap sack and stumbled toward the heavy iron door that led to the cellars and the deep crypts beneath the keep. The stone steps were slick with ice. She had to cling to the wall, her breathing ragged steam pluming from her lips in the freezing air. Just make it to the dark, she told herself. Just lock the door and wait it out. Let the bones crack. Let it pass. She reached the bottom of the stairs, stepping into the cavernous vaulted cellar. It smelled of earth decay and frost. Well, well, look what scurried into the dark. Brigid froze. The voice was slurred heavy with ale and arrogance. Corvin stepped out from behind a stack of wine casks. The massive general grinned, his jagged teeth flashing in the dim light of a single wall torch. He had a flagon in one hand. He was bored. When lichens got bored, humans suffered. Brigid kept her head down, clutching the burlap sack. "My lord, I am just fetching potatoes for the feast." She tried to step around him. Corvin shifted, blocking her path. His bulk was a solid wall of muscle and fur-lined armor. The feast, Corvin mused, taking a slow sip from his flagon. You servants eat our scraps, sleep under our roof, and yet you always look at us with such disgust. Look at you, trembling like a beaten dog. Brigid wasn't trembling from fear. She was trembling because her spine was attempting to reconfigure itself. A sharp cracking sound echoed in the cellar. Corvin paused. What was that? Nothing. Brigid choked out. She tasted blood. A canine tooth had just split her gum, elongating in her mouth. She kept her lips sealed tight. Please let me pass. Corvin dropped the flagon. It shattered on the stone. He grabbed Brigid by the throat and slammed her against the freezing wall. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. Pain lanced through her skull. I don't like your tone, human. Corvin snarled, leaning in close. His breath was hot and reeked of fermented grain. You don't smell right. You smell sick. You smell like... He sniffed her neck, his brow furrowing. Ash and poison. Above them, the heavy iron door at the top of the stairs groaned open. Boots sounded on the stone. Corvin. The voice was cold sharp, and carried the absolute weight of a mountain. Garrick stood on the stairs. He wore a heavy black fur cloak, his eyes piercing through the gloom of the cellar. He had come down for wine, or perhaps a moment of silence away from the sycophants in his hall. Corvin didn't let go of Brigid, but he turned his head. My king, just disciplining a disrespectful scullery maid. Let her go, Garrick commanded. It wasn't a request. She was creeping around the cellars. I said let her go. Garrick took a step down. Corvin scowled. His pride stung. He didn't release Brigid. Instead, he tightened his grip on her throat, squeezing hard enough to crush her windpipe. She needs to learn her place. That was the mistake. The pain in Brigid's throat was the final strike against the cracked glass of her control. Her human consciousness snapped. The cage shattered. 20 years of suppressed fury, agony, and instinct exploded all at once. It wasn't a magical, seamless transition. It was brutal, horrifying. Brigid's head snapped back. A guttural demonic sound ripped from her throat, a sound no human vocal cord could produce. It was the sound of a beast climbing out of hell. Corvin's eyes widened. He tried to pull back, but he couldn't. Crack! Brigid's arm snapped at the elbow. The bone jutting out before instantly re-knitting, thickening, covered in a sudden explosion of dense, silver-black fur. Her hand pinned against Corvin's chest, elongated into a massive, heavily padded paw, tipped with razor-sharp obsidian claws. Before Corvin could even shout, those claws sank effortlessly through his boiled leather armor and deep into his chest. Garrick froze on the stairs. The Alpha King who had fought in 100 wars stood paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. Brigid's body warped, tearing through her drab grey dress. Her spine arched violently, vertebrae popping with the sound of pistol shots in the echoing cellar. She grew. She didn't just turn into a wolf, she became a monster. Most lichens shifted into wolves the size of ponies. When Brigid's skull finally elongated, her human face tearing away to reveal a terrifying silver-furred snout, she was massive. She stood a full head taller than Corvin in her quadruped form. Her fur was the color of a thunderhead streaked with stark white. She let out a roar that shook the dust from the vaulted ceiling. Corvin screamed, finally releasing her throat, as he clawed blindly at the monstrous paw embedded in his chest. Brigid didn't hesitate. Her jaws, large enough to crush a heavy oak barrel, snapped forward. She locked her teeth around Corvin's shoulder and tossed him. The general, a man weighing over 250 pounds, flew across the cellar like a rag doll and smashed into the stone wall. He slumped to the floor unconscious, bleeding heavily. Silence descended on the cellar, thick and suffocating. The beast stood in the center of the room. She was panting, her hot breath pluming in the freezing air. Blood dripped from her silver maw. Slowly the massive wolf turned her head. Her eyes were not the gold or amber of a normal lichen. They were a piercing, luminescent ice blue, and they locked directly onto Garrick. Garrick stood on the stairs. He didn't draw his sword. He didn't shout for his guards. His heart pounded in his chest, a heavy, primal drumbeat. The scent hit him then. Stripped of the lie, the garlic, and the wolfsbane, her true scent crashed over him like a tidal wave. It was rain on hot iron. It was midnight snow. It was the most intoxicating, terrifying thing he had ever smelled. It was the scent of an alpha female, an equal, a mate. For the first time in his life, the king of the Iron Vale forgot how to breathe. The beast bared her blood-stained teeth, letting out a low, bone-rattling growl, and took a step toward him. The cellar air hung stagnant, thick with the metallic tang of Corvan's blood, and the ozone crackle of Brigid's raw power. Garrick didn't move. He couldn't. The Alpha King, a man who had ripped the throats from rival warlords and slept soundly in the mud of battlefields, was paralyzed. Every instinct in his blood roared a singular, deafening command mine. The scent of her was absolute. Rain on hot iron, midnight snow. It bypassed his logic carving straight into the primal architecture of his brain. It was a terrifying realization. A mate was a vulnerability. An alpha female was a rival. An alpha female who had just revealed herself in the heart of his fortress after hiding as a human servant for 20 years was a walking catastrophe. Brigid did not feel the bond. She felt only the cage snapping open. Her wolf was entirely feral drunk on the sudden rush of oxygen and the taste of blood in her jaws. She dropped her massive head, her ice-blue eyes locking onto the tall figure on the stairs. He smelled of dominance. He smelled of the bloodline that had burned her home to ash. A low, vibrating rumble started in her chest, shaking the dust from the stone arches above. "Easy," Garrick said. His voice was a low, commanding rasp. He didn't draw the heavy broadsword at his hip. A blade would only provoke her, and he knew with cold certainty that if he killed her, his own wolf would tear his mind apart in grief. He took a slow step down the stairs. He let his own aura bleed out into the room. It was a crushing, heavy pressure meant to force any lesser wolf to its belly. Brigid didn't bow. She bristled. The silver fur along her spine stood on end, making her look twice as large. She snapped her jaws, a warning click of teeth that sounded like two heavy stones colliding. "Submit," Garrick's wolf commanded, bleeding into his voice as he took another step. Brigid's response was a blur of motion. She didn't retreat. She attacked. She launched herself off her hind legs, clearing the distance between the cellar floor and the stairs in a single, impossible bound. Garrick had a fraction of a second to react. He threw his arms up, bracing for the impact of a 400-pound beast. She hit him like a battering ram. The force threw Garrick backward up the stone steps. They crashed into the heavy oak door at the top of the landing, shattering the iron latch. Wood splintered. The door gave way, spilling them out into the snowy courtyard above. Garrick hit the freezing mud sliding across the slick cobblestones. Brigid was on top of him instantly. Her massive paws pinned his shoulders, her claws biting through his thick fur cloak and scoring the leather armor beneath. Her jaws snapped down, aiming straight for his throat. Garrick caught her snout. His massive hands clamped around her jaws, holding the terrifying array of razor-sharp teeth inches from his neck. The physical contact was an electric shock. Fire raced up Garrick's arms. The mate bond screamed at him to let go, to bare his neck, to surrender to her. He gritted his teeth, his muscles bulging as he fought the physical weight of her and the psychological war in his head. "Stop," he grunted, his eyes flashing a brilliant predatory gold. Brigid thrashed violently. Her claws dug deeper into his shoulders, drawing blood. She was stronger than any wolf he had ever wrestled. The sheer, unadulterated rage fueling her was bottomless. She whipped her head to the side, breaking his grip on her snout, and slashed her paw across his chest. The blow tore through his armor and laid open 3 deep gashes across his ribs. Garrick roared pain, finally overriding his restraint. He kicked up his heavy boot, catching her in the stomach, throwing her off him. He rolled to his feet, blood seeping hot and dark down his side. He prepared to shift. His bones ached with the impending change. But Brigid didn't press the attack. She landed gracefully on all fours, her claws tearing gouges into the frozen earth. She looked at him, her chest heaving. The cold winter wind ruffled her silver-black fur. She looked magnificent, a nightmare carved from ice and shadow. Shouts erupted from the castle walls. Guards were running along the battlement's torches, flaring to life, illuminating the courtyard. Crossbows were being cranked. Brigid's ears flicked back. Survival instinct honed by 20 years of hiding sliced through the feral rage. She realized she was exposed. With one last piercing look at Garrick, a look that promised murder if he followed, she turned and bolted. She didn't run for the gates, she ran for the northern wall. She leaped onto a stack of wooden crates, scaled a stone buttress with terrifying speed, and vaulted over the battlements, disappearing into the black, howling abyss of the winter forest. Garrick stood in the courtyard, the snow swirling around him, painting his boots white. He pressed a hand to his bleeding ribs. He was breathing heavily, his eyes locked on the spot where she had vanished. "My king." Bran, the captain of the guard, sprinted into the courtyard, flanked by a dozen armed men. They skidded to a halt, seeing the blood on Garrick and the shattered door to the crypts. "Sound the horn." Bran shouted to his men. "Release the hounds. A rogue is inside the walls." "No." Garrick's voice stopped the men dead in their tracks. It was quiet, but it carried absolute authority. Bran blinked, confused. "Sire, you are bleeding. The beast. The hounds won't track her." Garrick interrupted. He lowered his hand from his ribs, looking at the blood on his palm. "And any man who fires an arrow at that wolf will answer to me. Tell Kyle to fetch the old healer for Corvin. He's bleeding out in the cellar." "But the rogue, sire, she is not a rogue," Garrick said softly, staring into the dark tree line. He could still smell her on his skin. He could still feel the phantom heat of her jaws. "She is the queen." The forest was a blur of dead wood and biting wind. Brigid ran. She didn't feel the snow packing between the pads of her feet. She didn't feel the jagged branches whipping against her face. She felt nothing but the intoxicating, terrifying high of absolute freedom. The earth rushed beneath her in a rhythmic blur. Stride, leap, land, stride. Her muscles cramped and atrophied from 2 decades of forced humanity stretched and snapped with brutal power. She was a ghost cutting through the dark. She leapt over fallen pine trunks that would have taken a man minutes to climb. She scrambled up steep, icy ravines without breaking her stride. For the first hour there was only joy. Pure, savage joy. The beast was out. The cage was broken, but freedom had a price, and her body was demanding payment. Somewhere deep in the Iron Valley, 5 miles from the castle walls, the adrenaline began to curdle. A sickening cramp seized her hind legs. Brigid stumbled, her chin ploughing into a snowbank. She scrambled up, shaking her massive head, but the world tilted. A sharp, coppery taste flooded her mouth. The wolfsbane. She had ingested enough of the toxic root to kill a horse just 3 hours ago, trying to suppress the full moon. Her shift had overridden the poison, temporarily burning it as fuel for her rage, but now the chemical was leaching back into her bloodstream. Her liver was failing. Her heart hammered an erratic, panicked rhythm against her ribs. She staggered forward, her vision tunneling. The silver-black fur began to recede, shedding in thick clumps against the snow. "No," the wolf whimpered. "Not back into the dark." She had no choice. Her body was collapsing under the strain. Brigid dragged herself beneath the sprawling roots of a massive dead oak tree, curling into a tight ball as the agonizing process of the reverse shift began. Bones cracked. tendons snapped and re-knitted. The fur melted into bare, freezing skin. It was infinitely worse than the transformation into the wolf, because this shift was returning her to a body that was dying of poison and hypothermia. Brigid screamed, but the sound tore from a human throat. When it was over, she lay shivering violently in the dirt. She was naked, coated in sweat that was rapidly freezing into a thin layer of ice on her skin. Her throat felt like it was packed with ground glass. Her left arm, where Corvin had grabbed her, was mottled with deep purple bruising. She forced her eyes open. It was still night. The wind howled through the dead branches above. She was going to freeze to death before the sun came up. Get up. A voice whispered in her head. It wasn't the wolf this time. It was the survival instinct of a bruised, battered human woman who had scrubbed floors for 20 years just to stay alive. Get up. Brigid rolled onto her stomach, digging her raw, cracked fingers into the frozen earth. She dragged herself out from under the roots. Every movement was a negotiation with agony. She scanned the dark woods. About 50 yards away, barely visible through the driving snow, she spotted the jagged silhouette of a trapper's lean-to. It was a crude shelter built by the castle huntsman for waiting out winter storms. She crawled toward it. Her knees left bloody streaks in the snow. When she finally breached the shelter, it was empty. It smelled of old grease and wet dog. But hanging over a crossbeam was a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket, and sitting in the corner was a pair of oversized leather boots left behind by a careless hunter. Brigid wrapped the blanket around herself, trembling so violently her teeth chipped against each other. She shoved her feet into the boots. They were far too large, but they were dry. She found a rusted skinning knife on a small wooden stump that served as a table. She gripped the bone handle, finding a pathetic measure of comfort in the cold steel. She huddled in the darkest corner of the lean-to, pulling the blanket over her head, trying to trap her body heat. The silence of the woods was heavy. Too heavy. Brigid closed her eyes, trying to focus her chaotic senses. Her hearing still sharp from the lingering wolf traits pushed through the sound of the wind. She heard a branch snap. Then the soft, rhythmic crunch of heavy boots on snow. Not a pack of hounds, not a squad of men. One man. He was tracking her. And he was fast. Brigid clutched the rusted knife tighter to her chest. She knew that scent. Ozone and old blood. Crushed pine. Garrick. He hadn't sent his guards. He had come to execute her himself. Garrick moved through the forest like a shadow detached from the night. He had shed his heavy armor, wearing only a thick leather tunic, hardened breeches, and his fur-lined cloak. The cold didn't bother him. His internal temperature ran high, fueled by the predator pacing just beneath his skin. He followed the trail of blood and silver fur. The scent of her was maddening. It was a chaotic mix of absolute alpha dominance and sickening chemical rot. As he tracked her, Garrick pieced together the horrifying truth. The faint smell of ash and bitter herbs mixed in her blood told the story. Wolfsbane. She had been poisoning herself. For years, judging by the way the scent clung to her very marrow. She had deliberately destroyed her own body to suppress her nature, hiding in plain sight within the walls of the man who had slaughtered her kind. The realization hit Garrick like a physical blow to the chest. He was a ruthless king, but he was not a monster. The sheer willpower, the unimaginable agony she must have endured to survive under his roof, commanded a strange, twisted respect. He found the spot where she had shifted back. The snow was melted, stained with sweat, and a small pool of blood from her raw knees. He knelt, pressing his bare fingers into the earth. The ground was still warm. He stood, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the dense thicket of pines. He could smell the rusted iron of the trapper's lean-to. He could hear the erratic, shallow fluttering of her human heartbeat. She was close, and she was terrified. Garrick walked slowly toward the shelter. He didn't try to hide his approach. He wanted her to know he was coming. He stopped a few feet from the entrance, letting the moonlight cut through the canopy to illuminate his face. "I know you are in there," he said. His voice was calm, cutting effortlessly through the howling wind. Inside the lean-to, silence. "The hounds would have torn you apart." Garrick continued, taking a step closer. "My men would have put 12 crossbow bolts in your back. You are lucky I came alone." "Don't come any closer." Her voice was ragged, destroyed by screaming, but it held no tremble. It was a cold, flat warning. Garrick stepped into the shelter. Brigid was backed into the far corner. She looked feral, even in her human skin. The moth-eaten blanket was draped over her shoulders, her hair plastered to her face with sweat and snow. She held the rusted skinning knife in her raw, blistered hands, the point aimed steadily at his chest. Garrick looked at the knife, then at her eyes. In the dim light, they weren't dull brown anymore. The shift had broken her human disguise completely. Her eyes were that piercing, luminescent ice blue. "Put the knife down," he said quietly. "I will put it through your throat if you take another step." Brigid hissed. Garrick didn't flinch. He looked at her battered, shivering frame. She was freezing to death. Her lips were turning a dangerous shade of blue. "You killed Corvan," Garrick stated flatly. "You broke his chest cavity. You tore open my ribs. You are a rogue, unregistered wolf who assaulted the king and murdered a general. By all laws of the territory, I should sever your head from your shoulders right now." Brigid's grip on the knife tightened. "Then do it. But know I will take an eye before I die." "I don't want your eye," Garrick said. He slowly reached up and unclasped the heavy fur cloak from his own shoulders. "And I don't want to kill you." Brigid laughed. It was a broken, cynical sound. "Right, the great king of the Iron Vale, famous for his mercy. You slaughter packs in their sleep. You killed my father. You burned my mother alive. Don't play games with me. Just draw your sword." Garrick froze. The accusation hung in the freezing air between them. He stared at her, the pieces finally clicking together. "The Northern Ridge," he murmured. 20 years ago, the Silvermane Pack." "Don't say their name," she snarled, taking a step forward, the knife shaking in her hand. "That was my father's war," Garrick said, his voice dropping an octave. "I was a boy. I didn't hold the torch. But you wear his crown. You live in the castle built on their bones." Brigid's breathing was shallow, erratic. The poison was taking its toll. Her knees buckled slightly, but she locked them, refusing to fall in front of him. Garrick saw the weakness. He moved with a speed that defied his massive frame. Before Brigid could thrust the blade, Garrick was on her. He didn't strike her. He simply caught her wrist with one hand, twisting it just enough to force her fingers to open. The rusted knife clattered harmlessly to the dirt floor. Brigid panicked, kicking out, trying to bite him, but Garrick used his other arm to wrap the heavy fur cloak around her shaking shoulders, pulling her flush against his chest. "Stop," he commanded. The proximity was devastating. The moment her skin touched his, the mate bond flared to life, not as a whisper, but as a roaring inferno. Brigid gasped, her struggles dying instantly as the shockwave hit her. It felt like being submerged in warm water after freezing in the snow. It was a deep, molecular recognition. Her wolf, weak and poisoned, whimpered in the back of her mind, not in fear, but in profound, desperate relief. Mine the beast purred. "No." Brigid whispered, tears of sheer frustration finally spilling over her lashes. "No, no, no, not you. Anyone but you." Garrick held her tight, wrapping his arms around the cloak, trapping her heat, trapping her. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of pine blood and snow. He could feel her heart hammering against his, their rhythms sinking in the dark. It seems the fates have a sick sense of humour. Garrick murmured against her skin, his voice rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in a decade. He didn't love her. Not yet. She was his enemy. She was an assassin waiting for a chance to strike. But she was his mate, and a wolf did not let its mate freeze in the dirt. "You are coming back with me," he said, pulling back just enough to look into her ice-blue eyes. Brigid glared up at him, her hatred warring violently with the biological tether pulling them together. "I will burn your castle down from the inside," she promised softly. Garrick offered a grim, cynical smile. "I look forward to watching you try, but tonight you survive." He didn't wait for her to argue. He swept her up into his arms, carrying her out of the lean-to and into the howling storm, holding his prisoner and his queen tight against his chest. Brigid woke to the smell of burning birch and roasting meat, a sharp contrast to the damp mildew of the servants' quarters. She didn't open her eyes immediately. She catalogued her body first. The glass-shard agony in her joints was gone, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. The agonizing cold that had settled in her marrow had been driven out by heavy wool blankets and the radiant heat of a massive hearth. Her wrist, where Corvin had grabbed her, was wrapped in thick linen smelling of comfrey and bitter aloe. "You are awake. Don't pretend you aren't." The voice was female, gravelly and tired. Brigid cracked an eye open. A woman sat by the fire grinding herbs in a stone mortar. She wore the dark leathers of a pack healer, her face crisscrossed with thin white scars from old skirmishes. "Where am I?" Brigid rasped. Her throat felt like a scraped chimney. "The king's chambers," the woman said, not looking up. "I am Brida, and you are a headache I didn't ask for. Drink this." She brought a clay mug to the bedside. Brigid pushed herself up against the headboard, the heavy blankets pooling at her waist. She realized she was wearing a clean linen shift. The panic spiked sharp and hot, but Brida scoffed before Brigid could speak. "I changed you. The king hasn't touched you. If he had, you wouldn't smell like a terrified stray dog trying to bite through its own leash." Brida shoved the mug into Brigid's hands. "Willowbark and elkbone broth. Drink. Your liver is screaming from the poison you've been feeding yourself." Brigid drank. It tasted like ash and fat, but it coated her throat and sent a rush of warmth to her stomach. She looked around. The room was massive, built of dark stone and heavy timber. Furs covered the floor. Weapons, swords, axes, daggers were displayed on the walls, impeccably oiled and deadly. It was a warlord's sanctuary. "Why am I alive?" Brigid asked, setting the empty mug on a bedside table. "Because the king is a stubborn fool." A deep voice answered from the doorway. Garrick stepped into the room. He had washed the mud and blood from his skin. He wore a simple black tunic and trousers, but he moved with the same predatory grace that commanded armadas. His left side was heavily bandaged where Brigid's claws had torn through his ribs. Brida stood giving a curt bow. Her fever broke sire, but the wolfsbane toxicity is deep. If she shifts again before the new moon, it might kill her. "Leave us," Garrick ordered. Brida gathered her mortar and pestle and slipped out the heavy oak door, leaving the click of the iron latch echoing in the sudden silence. Garrick walked to the foot of the bed. He didn't sit. He looked at her, his bruised sky eyes calculating. The air in the room grew heavy. The mate bond hummed between them, an invisible wire pulled taut, vibrating with every breath they took. Brigid hated it. She hated that her wolf wanted to press against his chest. She crossed her arms, digging her blunt human nails into her own skin to ground herself. "Corvin is dead," Garrick stated flatly. "You punctured his lung. He drowned in his own blood on the cellar floor." "Good," Brigid said. She didn't blink. "He was a pig." Garrick's jaw tightened. "He was my first lieutenant. He commanded half the standing army in the Iron Vale. His men are currently in the Great Hall calling for your head on a pike. They want the rogue who murdered their commander burned at the stake before nightfall. Then give them what they want." Brigid challenged, throwing the blankets off her legs. She stood ignoring the sharp spike of dizziness that washed over her. She was barely 5'6" in her human form, dwarfed by his sheer mass, but she refused to look up at him from a bed. "Drag me down there. Let them watch you execute the last survivor of the Silvermane. Stop trying to die!" Garrick snapped, his control slipping. He closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides, grabbing her by the shoulders. "You survived 20 years scrubbing my floors. Don't throw it away now because you're too proud to let me protect you." "Protect me?" Brigid laughed, a harsh, grating sound. She shoved her hands against his chest, right over his bandages. He flinched, but didn't let go. "Your father's men tore my mother to pieces while she screamed for mercy. They burned my cousins in their beds. You don't protect me, Garrick. You just want to cage me in a nicer room." Garrick stared down at her, his chest heaving. The proximity was intoxicating. Her scent pine snow and defiance was short-circuiting his logic. "My father was a butcher," Garrick said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "I am not him. I united the North so children wouldn't have to hide in root cellars covered in pig's blood. I built laws. I built peace. A peace built on fear isn't peace." Brigid spat back. "It's a hostage situation." "Then help me change it." The words stopped Brigid cold. Her hands froze against his chest. She looked up, searching his eyes for the lie. There was none. Only a weary, bone-deep exhaustion. "They won't accept you," Garrick said softly, his thumbs brushing the rough, lie-burned skin of her shoulders. "They smell the rogue on you. They smell the murder. But if they knew what you were, an alpha of the old bloodlines, my mate, they would have no choice but to kneel." "I am not your mate," Brigid whispered, though her traitorous body was leaning into his heat. "Lie to your ghost, Brigid," Garrick replied, leaning in until his lips brushed the shell of her ear. "But don't lie to the wolf. She knows who I am." He stepped back, severing the physical contact. The sudden loss of his heat made Brigid shiver. "Rest," Garrick commanded, walking back toward the door. "Tonight I address the pack. I will tell them you are mine. If you try to run, I will catch you. And next time, I won't be so gentle." The great hall smelled of sweat, stale ale, and mutiny. 300 wolves packed the cavernous space. These weren't the human servants. These were the Lycan elite. Warlords, knights, and pack elders. They were armed, restless, and angry. Garrick stood on the raised dais at the head of the hall. He wore his crown a brutal ring of jagged black iron and a heavy cloak of dire wolf fur. He looked every inch the tyrant king, but the tension in the room was a physical weight pushing against him. At the center of the floor stood Cale. He was Corvin's brother, a massive, heavily scarred brute who looked more bear than wolf. "The law is clear, my king." Cale barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "A rogue who kills a pack member forfeits its life. You harbor a murderer in your chambers. The men whisper that you've gone soft, that the rogue has clouded your mind with some witchery." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Eyes flashed gold in the dim torchlight. The pack was testing the fence, looking for a weak spot in their alpha's armor. "She is not a rogue," Garrick said, his voice rolling over the murmurs like thunder. "And she is no witch." "Then what is she?" Cale challenged, taking a step closer to the dais hand resting on the hilt of his broadsword. "A pet, a prize from the slums." Before Garrick could answer, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the great hall groaned open. The wind howled into the room, blowing out half the torches. Brigid walked in. She wasn't wearing the drab servant's dress nor the simple linen shift. She had raided the king's armory. She wore hardened leather breeches, a chainmail tunic that hung loose on her slender frame, and heavy steel-toed boots. Her mousy brown hair was pulled back into a severe braid. She walked with a slow, deliberate cadence. Not the hurried shuffle of a scullery maid, but the predatory stalk of a born killer. The hall fell dead silent. As she walked down the center aisle, she let her restraint snap. She stopped fighting the wolf. She didn't shift, but she let her aura bleed out into the room. It hit the pack like a physical blow. Wolves in the front rows instinctively took a step back, their heads dropping in sudden, unbidden submission. The scent of lye and garlic was gone. In its place was the suffocating, terrifying scent of an alpha female, pure, ancient, and violently angry. Kyle turned, his eyes widening as he caught the scent. His grip on his sword slipped. "What is this trick?" He snarled, though his voice lacked its previous volume. Brigid stopped 10 feet from Kale. She didn't look at Garrick. She kept her luminescent ice-blue eyes locked entirely on the massive lieutenant. "I am Brigid of the Silvermane," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a whetstone on steel. "Daughter of Ronan, rightful heir to the Northern Ridge." A collective gasp swept through the elders. The Silvermane name was supposed to be Ash. It was a ghost story used to scare pups. "You're a liar." Kyle spat, recovering his nerve. "The Silvermane were exterminated. You're a rogue playing dress-up." "Your brother didn't think so," Brigid said, tilting her head. "Not when I tore his heart out of his chest." Kyle let out a roar of pure rage. He drew his broadsword, a heavy slab of castle-forged steel, and charged. "No!" Garrick shouted, reaching for his own blade, preparing to leap from the dais. "Stay out of this, Garrick!" Brigid barked, her voice echoing with the sudden crushing weight of an Alpha command. To the shock of the entire hall, the Alpha King froze. It wasn't magic. It was the raw, undeniable authority in her tone, mixed with the absolute tether of their bond. He stopped, his knuckles white on his hilt, forced to watch. Kale swung the broadsword in a lethal horizontal arc, aimed right at Brigid's neck. Brigid didn't draw a weapon. She didn't have one. She simply dropped to her knees, sliding on the smooth flagstones, letting the heavy steel whistle mere inches over her head. As she slid past Kyle's guard, she drove her fist upward, aiming for the vulnerable gap in his armor beneath his armpit. But her hand wasn't human when it connected. In a fraction of a second, her arm warped. Silver-black fur exploded from her skin, her fingers elongating into a massive, heavily padded paw, tipped with razor-sharp obsidian claws. The claws sank deep into Kyle's ribcage. Kyle screamed, dropping his sword. Brigid didn't stop. She used the momentum of her slide to yank her arm back, tearing a massive chunk of leather and flesh from his side. She rolled to her feet, her arm snapping back into its human form before the blood even hit the floor. She stood over the bleeding lieutenant, her chest heaving, her eyes glowing like twin stars. "Shift," Brigid commanded him, pointing a blood-soaked finger at Kyle's face. "Shift and fight me, you coward. Let the pack see how the Iron Veil butchers fare against a real wolf." Kyle's pride was a fragile, dangerous thing. Fractured in front of 300 seasoned killers, it demanded immediate violent compensation. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The toxic, furious yellow bleeding into his irises signaled the absolute end of his humanity. His transformation was a brutal, ugly process. The Iron Veil wolves were bred for size and raw power, and it showed in the sickening crack of his spine expanding. His boiled leather armor tore at the seams, the heavy metal rivets popping like crossbow bolts across the great hall. Kale's jaw unhinged, extending into a massive, froth-slicked snout, his teeth lengthening into jagged yellow spikes. Within seconds, a 400-pound brown wolf stood where the lieutenant had been, its coarse fur bristling with malice. He launched himself off the flagstones with a deafening, guttural roar. Brigid did not flinch. She did not bother stripping off the oversized chainmail tunic she had stolen from the armory. She welcomed the pain of the iron biting into her skin. It was nothing compared to the slow chemical rot of wolfsbane she had endured for 2 decades. Her shift was instantaneous. It was an explosive physical release of 20 years of compressed, suffocating rage. The chainmail simply gave way, iron links shattering and pinging off the stone pillars as her skeletal structure warped and thickened. The silver-black fur erupted from her pores, drinking the dim torchlight. When Kyle's jaws snapped at the empty air, where a human woman had stood a fraction of a second prior, they met the solid, unyielding shoulder of a predator just as massive. The collision shook the dust from the vaulted ceiling. It was the sound of a battering ram striking a fortress gate. They became a chaotic, brutal knot of teeth and claws. The pack scrambled backward, overturning heavy wooden benches and spilling kegs of dark ale in their desperation to clear the floor. They formed a wide, terrified circle, watching in stunned silence. Kyle fought like a brawler. He threw his immense weight recklessly against Bridget, trying to drive her to the slick flagstones, aiming his jaws squarely at her windpipe. He wanted a quick execution. Bridget fought like a survivor. She knew how to internalize pain. When Kyle lunged, she deliberately left her left flank open. His jaws clamped down heavily on her shoulder. The sickening crunch of her collarbone splintering echoed in the quiet hall. Kyle's eyes flashed with triumph, but it was a fatal miscalculation. Bridget didn't pull away. She leaned into the bite, forcing Kyle's teeth deeper, anchoring him to her. Using the horrific leverage, she twisted her massive body underneath his. She planted her powerful hind legs squarely against his exposed stomach and kicked upward with the terrifying force of a coiled spring. Kyle was entirely uprooted. The heavy brown wolf flew over her head, soaring backward through the air. He crashed violently into the high table, splintering the thick oak into jagged kindling. Roasted boar heavy silver platters, and Kyle's massive body slammed into the stone floor in a ruin of blood and splintered wood. Before the lieutenant could even process the impact, Bridget was on him. She didn't just attack his physical body. She dismantled his absolute certainty. She planted one heavily padded clawed paw squarely on his chest, pinning him to the wreckage. Her jaws snapped forward, locking seamlessly around his thick neck. She didn't bite down to sever the artery. She simply squeezed. She cut off his oxygen, forcing him to feel the undeniable disparity in their strength. She released a low, vibrating growl from deep within her chest. It wasn't a feral snarl. It was the sound of a conquering warlord asserting her territory. It rolled heavily through the great hall, vibrating the marrow of every lichen present. Kyle thrashed wildly his claws, scraping uselessly against her silver-black fur. But as his lungs burned and his vision darkened, the fight drained entirely out of him. His movements grew sluggish, his tail tucked tight against his belly. A pathetic, high-pitched whine, the universal sound of total submission, slipped through his teeth. He bared his neck completely to her. Bridget held him there. She counted to 5, letting the heavy silence stretch, ensuring every single warlord, elder, and knight in the room witnessed the absolute capitulation of their finest fighter. Then, with a dismissive shove, she released his throat. She backed away her massive paws, leaving bloody prints on the stones. She stood in the center of the ruined hall, bleeding heavily from her ruined shoulder, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Her luminescent ice-blue eyes swept over the crowd. 300 killers stared back at her. The scent in the room had shifted entirely. The stale ale and mutiny were gone, replaced by the sharp metallic tang of fear and sudden absolute reverence. A knight in the front row dropped to his knees. The heavy clank of his plate armor hitting the stone was the catalyst. Beside him, an elder bowed his head, exposing his throat. It cascaded through the room like a falling tide. Row by row, the elite warriors of the Iron Veil dropped to the floor, submitting to the rogue who had washed their filthy linens just a week prior. Bridget felt no flush of triumph. The adrenaline was already curdling, leaving behind a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. The cage was broken, but her body was failing. The residual wolfsbane in her liver flared, a searing reminder of her mortality. She turned her massive, blood-stained snout towards the dais. Garrick was the only one still standing. He was the Alpha King. His knees did not bend. But the cold, calculating cynicism that usually masked his features was entirely gone. He looked at the magnificent scarred beast standing in the wreckage of his hall with a burning, unmasked awe. He stepped down from the dais. He didn't command her to shift. He didn't announce his authority. He simply walked through the sea of kneeling, terrified wolves, uncaring of the blood ruining his boots, until he stood mere inches from her face. He reached out. His large, calloused hand gently cupped the side of her snout, his thumb smearing a line of Kale's blood across her silver fur. The contact was a grounding wire. Brigid let out a long, ragged exhale. She couldn't hold the form for another second. She closed her eyes and let gravity and the reverse shift take her. The terrifying beast melted away. Bones cracked and shrank, fur receding into bruised, pale skin. It was a violently abrupt return to humanity. She was falling completely bare and shivering in the freezing hall, but she never hit the ground. Garrick caught her. He immediately wrapped his heavy dire wolf cloak around her slender shoulders, pulling her fiercely against his chest. He trapped her heat against his own body, shielding her naked vulnerability from the pack. He held her tight, turning slightly, so the kneeling masses could see only the king holding his equal, the Silvermane live. Garrick's voice rang out. It was a thunderclap in the quiet hall, absolute and uncompromising. She is Brigid. She is your queen, and any man who questions her place in this keep will answer to my blade. The silence was absolute. No one moved, no one dared even breathe too loudly. Brigid rested her damp forehead against the hard muscle of Garrick's chest. She listened to the heavy, steady thud of his heart. It was a maddening contradiction. She hated him for the crown he wore and the blood on his family's name. But the biological tether binding them was real, forged in violence and mutual survival. I still want to burn this fortress down. She whispered, her voice weak, raw, and scraping against his collarbone. Garrick let out a dark, low chuckle that vibrated through her battered frame. He tightened his grip on her waist. I know you do, little wolf, he murmured, pressing a kiss into her damp, mousy hair. We'll burn it all down together, and build something better on the ashes. Did Brigid and Garrick's fierce, blood-forged romance keep you hooked? The clash of iron and ice proves that the most powerful cages are the ones we break from the inside. If you loved this deep, gritty dive into the heart of the Silvermane and the Iron Vale, don't leave this story in the shadows. Smash that like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance and werewolf fantasy fans, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another epic tale. Drop a comment below. Would you have forgiven the Alpha King? See you in the next story.